Yesterday we talked about the different subsets of real numbers, like how to classify them and put them into categories. Today we're going to talk about the properties of real numbers. So most of all the definitions are already written out in this chart here for you, so we're just going to talk about the different examples and how to identify these properties. So the first one is the closure property of addition. This just means that the sum, so remember sum is when you add numbers. So the sum of any two real numbers is a real number. Basically, that just means like 2 plus 3, both of those are real. You add them together, you get 5. That's another real number. All the numbers we know so far are real anyway, so this shouldn't be too much of a surprise. So this closure property of addition is just whenever you add something. Whenever you add numbers together, you can do it because of this closure property of addition. The next one, closure property of multiplication, same idea, but for multiplication. So that the product, which means multiplication, when you multiply numbers. The product of any two real numbers is a real number. So it's the same idea. 2 times 3, 2 and 3 are both real. Multiply them together, you get 6, which is also real. And so whenever you multiply numbers together, you can do so because of this closure property of multiplication. Okay, those two are pretty straightforward, just adding and multiplying. So the next two properties are the commutative properties. There's commutative property of addition and the commutative property of multiplication. So with both of these, basically we're just changing the order. Doesn't affect either the sum or the product. So this example here for the commutative property of addition, a plus b is the same as b plus a. The order doesn't matter when you're adding. So an example would be like 5 plus 6 is the same as saying 6 plus 5. Either way you add them, you're going to get 11 both times. So this is where the numbers you're adding flip. So just the order changes. And the same goes for the commutative property of multiplication, which is the next one. Changing the order when multiplying does not affect the product or the answer to the multiplication problem. A times b is the same as saying b times a. Order doesn't matter. So for example, 5 times 6 is the same as saying 6 times 5, you get 30 either way. So that's when the numbers you're multiplying flip. Okay, so whenever the order is flipping, those are commutative properties. So a way that maybe can help you remember that is commutative. Think about it as like your commute to school. It's the same distance going to school and coming back home, but the order that you're doing it is changing. So you either go from home to school or school to home, different order, same distance. So like your commute. So commute and commutative. Same distance, different order. Same answer, different order. Okay, so commutative is when they flip. Then we have the associative properties of addition and multiplication. So associative property of addition is changing the grouping when adding does not affect the sum. So with order of operations with these, right, we'd have to do what's inside the parentheses first. We'd have to add a plus b and then add c. But that would be the same as if we added B plus C first and then added A. So here the parentheses moved. They were around the A and the B, but then they moved to be around the B and the C. So grouping, or this associative property, is when the parentheses move. And an example would be if we had 2 plus 3 in parentheses and then we added 4. That would be equal to if we did 3 plus 4 first and then added 2, right? Here we would do our parentheses first and get 5 plus 4. Then on the right side we would do 3 plus 4 first. And either way, we still get 9. So again, it's just when the grouping changes, when the parentheses move. The order is still the same. Right, it's still 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4. The order of the numbers is the same, just the parentheses are moving. And multiplication, same idea, just multiplying instead of adding. So changing the grouping when multiplying does not affect the product. So first our parentheses were around A times B, and then they move to be around B times C. So again, the parentheses move. So if we had like 2 times 3 times 4, they move the parentheses to be around the 3 and the 4. And the order is still the same, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, but the parentheses have moved. So order of operations, we would do on the left side 2 times 3 first. And on the right side, we do 3 times 4 first. And either way, we get 24 on both sides. And the order is still the same. Okay, so if the order is changing, it's a commutative property. If parentheses are moving, it's the associative property. If you want to think about it with the associative, like the parentheses are associating two variables together, they're grouping them together. So whenever the parentheses move. Associating numbers together with parentheses. So we're just changing what two numbers are being associated, are being multiplied first or added first. But you would still get the same answer either way. Okay, so those are the big ones. You just have to make sure you can remember the difference between the commutative ones where the order is flipping and the associative ones where the order stays the same but parentheses are moving. And then our last one is hopefully a property you are familiar with already, the distributive property of multiplication over addition. You can just call it the distributive property. You don't have to write the whole long name. But the distributive property is just if you have some addition happening in parentheses and then a number being multiplied on the outside, this number would get multiplied to every term inside the parentheses. So you're distributing that multiplication. So for example, if we had 2 times 3 plus 6, that would be the same as doing 2 times 3 plus 2 times 6. Okay, so the difference between the distributive property and like the closure of multiplication. The closure property of multiplication is just a plain old boring multiplication problem. So like each one of these individually would demonstrate the closure of multiplication. But when we do this distributing in order to get to that point, that's what makes this the distributive property. All right. So we have this table of all of the properties. What you're going to have to be able to do is identify what property is being demonstrated in different types of equations. So if we look at example 1, 1a. So we have the square root of 3 times 7 equals 7 times the square root of 3. So a couple things to notice when you're trying to identify properties is, first, do we have either addition or multiplication happening? Which one? Multiplication, yeah, we're multiplying. So that kind of narrows down our options for what property it can be being demonstrated. And then, to determine the difference between associative property of multiplication or commutative property of multiplication, we just have to see if our numbers are being flipped, if the order is changing, or if there are parentheses that are being moved. So in this one, there's not even any parentheses to deal with, and the order did flip, right? We did square root of 3 times 7, and then it flipped to 7 times the square root of 3. So when the order changes like that, that is the commutative property. And since we were multiplying, it'd be the commutative property of multiplication. So commutative property of multiplication. You can abbreviate like property with prop and multiplication. If you want to use the multiplication sign, that's fine. But I do want you to write out commutative, at least. All right. Let's take a look at, let's take a look at D. So in letter D, we have square root of 2 plus, and then in parentheses, square root of 3 plus square root of 7 equals square root of 2 plus, and then in parentheses, square root of 7 plus square root of 3. So from the left side of the equation to the right side of the equation, what has changed? What is different when you go to the right side? Huh? Yeah, the order of what? Yeah, and the stuff in the parentheses, the square root of 7 and the square root of 3 flipped from how they were on the left-hand side. So here, our order flipped. So even though that is happening in parentheses, it can't be the associative property because the parentheses didn't move. They're still grouping the same two numbers together. What changed is the order of those numbers in the parentheses. When we have our order that flips, that is a commutative property. And since the two numbers that flipped were being added, that makes it the commutative property of addition. So again, you can write out commutative, and then you can abbreviate it to property as prop of. You can do the plus sign for addition. Okay. So I want you guys just to take a minute and try to do the rest of those in example 1, just to identify what property is being used. So use the table to help you and identify the property. There's only one property that's happening per question. Okay, so take a few minutes and go ahead and finish up example 1. Okay, so letter B. So going from the left side of the equation to the right side of the equation, what changed? What's different? Yeah, the parentheses, they moved. They were around the 4 plus 7, but then they moved to be around the 7 plus 6. The order of the numbers, 4, 7, 6, is still the same. It's still 4, 7, 6. So since the order is the same, that means it can't be the commutative property. And since the parentheses moved, that means it has to be the associative property the numbers are being added, so it'd be the associative property of addition. Again, I do want you to write out the word associative, but then you can abbreviate property of addition. Okay, letter C. So what happened here from the left to the right side? Well, the parentheses are gone. They didn't move. So what did they do? Yeah, they distributed. They took this 2 and they multiplied it by the 3 and by the square root of 5 to get 6 to square root 5. So when we distribute, that's the distributive property. Okay, we did D. So E. What was different here, going from left to right? Yeah, the parentheses moved again. We had 4 times 7, then they moved to 7 times 3. So since parentheses moved, that means it has to be associative, and the numbers are being multiplied. So it would be the associative property of multiplication. Again, you have to make sure you have the word associative and the multiplication symbol, because there's 2 associative properties. So you got to make sure you're specifying what one. Okay, letter F. What was different for this one going left to right? The order of the stuff in the parentheses. Square root 5 plus 4 changed to 4 plus square root 5. So when the order flips, that's commutative, and the numbers that flipped were being added. So it would be the commutative property of addition. Okay, letter G. This was another distributive one, because the parentheses disappeared. They didn't move, they just were gone because we did this multiplication. We distributed the 2 to the square root 6 and to the 7. And then the last one. What changed here? Going left to right. The order, yeah. The 2 was being multiplied out in front, but then it moved to being multiplied after the parentheses. So since the order changed, that means it has to be commutative. And the numbers that flipped, in this case it's the 2 and this stuff happening in the parentheses, these were being multiplied. So that means it'd be the commutative property of multiplication. All right. Any questions with identifying? So really you just have to, it's like a spot the difference thing. If you find what's different from the left to the right side, you can make identifying the property pretty easy. On the back, we're just going to practice with the distributive property here. So just a couple, actually I think you guys can, do you guys feel comfortable with distributive property? You want to just try some? Okay. Take a couple minutes and go ahead and do the distributive property with these in example 2. Make sure you are paying attention to the variables that are being used. We'll go over them in a minute. Alright, so I have the ones for A through D, A, B, C, and D up here. These are pretty straightforward. You just take the number out in front, it gets multiplied by everything. Inside the parentheses, variables, those X's just carry on. Any questions on those first 4? Okay, for letter E, when we do the distributive property, so now we have a 2x that's outside the parentheses. So when we multiply, we have to make sure we bring that x along every time. So when we distribute, we would have 6x. And then minus 18xy, because we can't combine the x and the y because they're 2 different variables, so they just have to stay just being multiplied together. So it'd be 18 times x times y. Questions on E? Okay. Letter F, when we have a 5x out in front, and you multiply it by that first term, 2x. Now both of those terms have the variable of x. So if we multiply first the numbers out in front, the 5 and the 2, that gives us 10. And then what's x times x? X squared. So we'd have 10x squared plus 40x. Just got to remember that when you have the same variable times itself, that'll be squared. If it's two different variables that you're multiplying together, like the x and the y, they just stay separate, x and y. All right, do you guys have any questions?